Actually remembered to start it early this time. Glenn, can you all see that that website in the chat this time? If somebody just wants to put something in the Q&A, I'll put it in the no. Yeah, I don't know what the deal is. It's telling me you can see it, so I'll just put it right here. So, just a reminder to people that have just jumped on, all the recordings, the class slides, the various resources, toolkits are available at a new website I created for these classes at kcows.us/advisory group DEI. And at the end of when you shut out of this webinar, you will get a survey. If you please take that and give us some feedback and other ideas for future training. And it's 5:30, so I will just give a couple introductory remarks. So I mentioned the survey, I mentioned the website. The way this is going to work tonight, since we have two classes almost back to back, is we'll conclude this class and we'll shut down this webinar. And then I will start the second webinar, which is a separate address. And the reason that we did it this way is so that we have two separate recordings for each class instead of one long 2-hour session. So that way, for people that want to reference just one class or the other, it's much easier for them to get to that. And we've got a lot more resources coming to the webpage, so please check back. I'll be sending a follow-up email out to county staff with some suggestions and ideas about how you can better utilize this training with your advisory groups. And with that, I will introduce Lucretia. Again, we're so happy to have you back. Lucretia Robertson. If you missed the first class, that was a really terrific introduction to the fundamentals of diversity, equity, and inclusion work and how we can apply it to what we do with our advisory group. So we're just so grateful to have her, and she's just been great in putting these courses together and really tailoring them for our advisory group. So again, please take the survey at the end, and you'll have to close out of this one and join the next webinar for the next class. This is the second class in a series of 3 classes, and this is guiding frameworks for equitable and inclusive engagement. Lucretia.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good evening, everyone. I hope that you are well and safe wherever you are. We only have about an hour together, so we'll feel like I am speeding through things. That is not my intention. I want to get as much before you as I can. So the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see that. And then I'll just go through some of what I shared last week, and then a little bit more for, not last week, the last session, a little bit more for this session. I'm going to hide my videos simply so that you're focusing on the slides and I'm not constantly looking at myself. It's a little different when we're all on Zoom together. So here we go. So we are here today, of course, around for guiding frameworks for equitable and inclusive engagement. Surprise, surprise, you have already started that journey. And so we're in the process of continuing that today. Like I shared the last time, I think it's very important at moments when we're together in spaces that may be the ancestral lands of Indigenous tribes, that we acknowledge that. And so I share my land acknowledgement with you. What you might hear me say throughout our time today is that some of what I'm sharing with you, although it's something that I use as a practice for myself, you are free to take and use as your own practice. One of the things, the messages I think that isn't conveyed enough is that some of the equity work that we need to do, beginnings of that work, is not as hard as we make it, right? So some of it is around acknowledgement and making those things invisible visible, and a land acknowledgement does that for us. So today, our learning journey is this. We're going to look at some of the models that I shared before and kind of touch on some of what I mentioned in class 1, really brief. And then we'll jump into some models that will help us think about advancing our equity goals, and then also about looking at equity in our planning and our implementation. So I shared this with you last time we were together. I share this with you again as a way to bring in diverse lived experiences. That is to say, where are you at, not only emotionally, but what is your internal state, to kind of help you prepare yourself for learning. This is a good practice even as you start your meetings. Sometimes we come from other obligations, other commitments, our families, boards that we sit on, work, things of that nature. It's really important when we come together to think about how are we making time for the human side of us, right? So how are we doing in this moment? What's happening that might be distracting us and preventing us not only from learning, but engaging meaningfully enough and thoughtfully enough so that when we make decisions, they come from a place that's not hurried, but that's intentional. I shared this in class 1 again, community building practices. Again, this is something that you can share, you can take and share with your own groups and your own meetings and your own subgroups and things of that nature in your discussions, right? It's a way to set a framework for how we're going to hold a conversation, because oftentimes the answer, the solution we're looking for is in a conversation. And if those conversations are not structured in a way that is safe and productive, I think we've all been in places where you get absolutely nowhere. That's just my human conversation quote that I shared last time. And what's most important to me is that human conversation is the ancient and easiest way to cultivate conditions for change. And so I encourage you to promote conversations on your teams, in your committee, in your groups, whatever or wherever it might be happening. But I encourage conversation so that we can share human experience and learn from one another. All right, the last time what I shared was this process for learning that I encourage all of us to engage in, and that is that we widen our lens. Things are happening around us, they're happening in our communities, systemically, nationally. By looking at it through a wider lens, we are less likely to have a biased approach to our solutions. We look back to look forward because we're looking back to see not only history, but the impact of history. We'll talk a little bit today about equity impacts. And that's the point I'm making here, is we look back to think about, to reflect on, to gather data on decisions that we've made and the impact that those decisions have had on us, our communities, and so forth. And then we reflect out to reflect in. I say that again because we are well-meaning human beings who want the best for others and ourselves, and yet our intention is not enough. We need to be thinking about what is the impact of that intention. I may intend well by saying to someone, "You look good today," but the impact of that might be to someone, and I say that jokingly, the impact of that to someone else might be, well, what did I look like on the other days? Right? So that's a very simple example and it's kind of humorous, but the point is we need to reflect out, look at the world and the community around us, look at the person sitting next to us in our meetings to think about what is the impact of the decisions and the actions that I'm taking in this moment. So let's talk about the frameworks that let's talk about the frameworks that we looked at last time. Let's talk about it, but I'll review those real quick. So the first one we talked about was the cycle of socialization. I brought that up because I wanted us to think about how we are socialized very early on to think about differences and commonalities, and how that socialization oftentimes reinforces a thought and a pattern of behavior that is later institutionalized across different systems and are experienced by folks, those who are similar to us and those who are different from us, in very different ways. So either I experience it as a reward, or I might experience it as some type of punishment or disadvantage. And so having this conversation is really important because, again, when we think about looking back on impacts, well, we're looking back on our results. We're looking at data, we're looking at anecdotal data, quantitative, qualitative, whatever you might want to reference to think deeply about decisions that were made early on that were probably reinforced by some messages that we received early on in our socialization that basically told us what we get is what we get. But we're challenging that to say what we get today, to say what we get is not what we get. And we can change those results at these decision points, right? So that means that there's some action we have to take to change how our decisions are impacting the communities that we serve. And that might mean going back a little further to change how we come about those decisions. Okay, mouth got dry all of a sudden. So the other model we shared really quickly was around the wheel of social identity. That was, again, to share the idea that we all have a different lived experience. We experience life differently. Obviously, the cycle of socialization is evidence of that, but this was a way to think deeply about how identity might be impacted by some of the decisions, actions, and even thought patterns that we have. If you remember this exploring identities, we talked a little bit in this exercise about how to do some self-reflection, to really just think about, based on the identities that you either claim or ascribe to you, how might you be experiencing the world around you? How might others perceive you? And are there opportunities available to you that might not be available to others based on an identity? Or the reverse of that, right, is what are the barriers that I might experience as opposed to opportunities? And be aware that we're building on this. We're using these models to help us think about how my identity, or the way I perceive my identity, might be showing up in the decisions that I make. And this is really important. I want to stop here to say this is really important to stop and think about, because oftentimes we make decisions from the perspective of the identity that gives us the greatest opportunity, whereas there are folks who are experiencing disparities or disadvantages because those decisions don't take into account their experiences, right? A really evident identity that we often are considerate of, but still are yet learning about, is ability. When we think about physical ability, oftentimes as a person who does not have a disability or any visible disability, I may be making decisions based on how it impacts me without regard to how it impacts someone with a physical disability. And then the other model that we talked about was bias, implicit bias. And the point here is that through the cycle of socialization, we may have some higher level thinking that's reinforced. And what that does is then form these patterns of behavior and maybe unjust and unequal actions that are experienced through maybe inequality, discrimination, abuse, harassment. And those are big words. This is not to suggest that anyone in this call might be a party to such things. But again, because all of us, myself included, holds some form of bias because it's been socialized and reinforced in me so early on, it's really important that we stop and think about, is this decision based on information that I have or something that I've assumed to be true? We also talked about the framing effect, right? So the way in which data is presented really can affect our perception of that data. And I frame data around the assumptions, AKA bias, that I might have. And because this bias is unknowing to me, it's unconscious, it's something that's hidden, and unless I explore it, I may repeatedly frame or approach a situation, a decision, a discussion in the way that reflects my needs, reflects my assumptions, reflects my goals and my agenda, but doesn't have that widened lens, as we talked about earlier. And so it's establishing early on that it is possible for all of us, myself included, to have a bias that informs the way I deliver data is really important, because then it causes me to challenge the data and challenge the way that I present that data. We also talked about individual biases and how that over time may lead to a systems imbalance. I don't think I have to go into too much detail in this slide, particularly because I believe all of us have been around long enough to know that oftentimes patterns of behaviors, thought patterns, even the decisions that we've made have been passed down from one, a set of leaders or generation to the next. We are all born into imbalanced, inequitable systems. Nothing that we've created, but something that we could definitely have a part in addressing. So from a individual set of biases, we may together through our exchanges, whether across commonalities or difference, form power imbalances, and that happens interpersonally. That then informs institutional policies and practices that might be oppressive or disadvantage some groups. I can think back, well, this wasn't necessarily my lifetime, but we have all been very aware of the differences that might exist in the workplace, used to exist in the workplace to some extent, between men and women. And so that's a good frame to think about power imbalances, and then how that is passed on around across systems. This diagram says structures, this says systems, but the point is that those patterns are then repeated across systems. So if I use the example of men and women, we know that there are various instances across different institutions where women were at a disadvantage because of internal biases held in the system. And then we talked about equality and equity, and I thought it was really important to bring this up because we often get confused about what is equality and what is equity. We know that equality means that everyone is treated the same exact way, regardless of difference, and equity means everyone is provided what they need to succeed, especially given that we know historically some people are not starting out from the same place. So I use this diagram to help us visually think about equality and equity. And then finally, it's like it doesn't want to, there we go. Finally, we looked at this self to systems, starting with an equity lens. So we use an equity lens as a metaphor that really primes us to look deeper at root causes. So we've kind of already started that practice because we've looked at history. If you recalled, we looked at some historic legislation. We've also looked at it at an equity lens in a way when we looked back at the cycle of socialization, because we're looking back at root causes that might help us understand why are some underrepresented groups experiencing governmental systems in the way that they are experiencing them. Why are they experiencing across institutions and at a systemic level, why are they experiencing disparate outcomes? Oh, with an equity lens, I can look back and think about who benefited from these decisions, who was not included in these decisions, what contributed to that exclusion, and what could I do differently to ensure inclusion of these groups. So now let's look at inclusive public engagement, which was the purpose of our time together. I frame this as advancing our equity goals because it is really important in public, I would say in public facing roles, whatever that role might be, that we ensure the public is involved, our stakeholders. Someone I read somewhere said careholders, our careholders are involved in the decisions, the design of those decisions, and the eventual implementation of those decisions, because we are looking to advance equity, not just as a process, but as an outcome. So as we move forward this hour and the next hour, what I would ask you to sit and think about is, what is our intention? What is my intention? What do I expect of myself, of others, as I advise, recommend, and decide on the important work of public engagement? I think it's really important that we establish a goal. I guess a lot of things are important. I'm saying that a lot today, but it's important that we, you, all of us establish a goal so that we know where we're headed to. So that way we can look back and think about what are the steps towards achieving that goal. And then this has more meaning for you as well if you have an idea of what your intention is for public engagement. So real quickly, before we go any deeper, I want to make sure I make clear to those who are here, what is public participation? I took this from the International Association of Public Participation. We can call it public participation, public engagement, public involvement. Those terms are used interchangeably, but they essentially mean the same thing. So by public engagement or participation, what I'm really saying is that it's a series of events that build trust and help foster increased understanding. So these are not meetings just to have meetings. This is not just sharing information to say I shared information. This is about dialogue. This is about transparency. This is about opening up opportunities for questions, so that our decisions are improved over time and that they accurately and appropriately reflect the needs, interests, and thoughts of participants, or in this conversation, of underrepresented populations. So this is an opportunity to hear from not only constituents, but to hear from people affected by these decisions, even if they may not be our constituents. And then along with that, public participation or public engagement is the process itself that involves participants in the problem solving or the decision making, and uses their input to make decisions. So these are definitions that I would like for you to hold on to, because again, public engagement is not around simply checking a box to say, I included you, I asked you, I got your thoughts and input, but it's an opportunity to use that input to correct the imbalances in the systems, we've talked about that before, from those who have the lived experiences. So when we talk about public engagement, when we talk about building trust, transparency, collecting data and information, and listening to those experiences of those more deeply impacted by decisions or around a design of a program or a policy, what I'm encouraging us to think about is, what is inclusive engagement? What do we mean by inclusion? That is not simply come sit at the table. It is, what do you want on the menu, right? What do you want to eat? That type of thing. So dialogue often looks like we facilitate understanding about the projects. I tell you, you ask some questions, you might give me some feedback, and then we have some understanding about the project. I might provide a forum for concerns to be shared, and I might turn that dialogue, and that depends on the extent of that conversation. I might use this space to also get ideas and recommendations and to collect input. That could be considered dialogue. On the far right, let's look at decision. I might take an action on the ideas and the input that I heard, and that helped to form the decision. It may also look like those who are affected were involved. And so they sat around the table. And I might be able to say that participation was shaped by their involvement and that they were able to be part of co-designing the decision. But inclusive engagement looks like meaningful relationships with the public. And in this regard, again, we're talking about under-recognized populations. It means relationship building in that regard. So it then extends beyond the meeting room. It extends beyond sitting around the table. Inclusive engagement also looks like there have been attempts and efforts to facilitate understanding and trust, so that we're digging deeper, we're asking questions, answering questions, we're providing information, and we're asking underrepresented folks or the public who are sitting around the table, what is it that you need from us in order to rebuild, reinforce, foster trust? Ooh, see, I typo. Inclusive engagement also means that I have taken the time to learn about the needs and priorities of those sitting around the table. So I'm not using this opportunity to say, teach me. I'm using this opportunity to say, I want to know more. So before you sit at the table or you have a meeting or you're engaging with the public, it's good to do your research and to find out more about the public that you serve. I'm pretty sure this is happening, but I'm encouraging us to lean into this more, particularly when we have groups of folks who may be disenfranchised because of past historic actions. Inclusive engagement also allows for meaningful input, right? So it's not just tell me what I want to hear, or here are the very specific questions that I want you to answer, but it's really around tell me more statement that I said earlier. So this is what we want to know, but what else should we know? That's a question to think about. What else should we know? And then finally, inclusive engagement, as a result, improves the quality of the decisions made and consensus around decisions. So when we're intentional about inclusive engagement, I believe, and I've experienced this before, we can get closer to consensus around decisions, particularly decisions that might be tough for some communities to buy into. And one of the thoughts I want to share here is that the goal of public engagement is that we want inclusion, right? We want inclusion because we want to see fair access and fair representation, diverse representation. We want public engagement. We want dialogue. We want discourse that's open, collaborative, flexible, and empowering. That's the goal of public engagement. If not, then you're just information sharing, and you can just have your communications person send out a press release. And that's achieved through equitable processes. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The result of that, of course, is that I've already shared about quality decisions, but then we get this broad perspective. We get broad identities represented, and that is the diversity piece that is often talked about. That's where we get the diversity. But we start first by ensuring an inclusive engagement process. All right, hopefully you can see this. So what I'm sharing here is, again, from the International Association of Public Participation. They have a spectrum of public participation that I've kind of tweaked a little bit here and adapted for this conversation. And essentially what these choice points that I'm sharing with you hope to accomplish is to share ways in which, or levels at which we might engage the public. And I understand that there are times where we can't fully engage the public because of existing statutes or budgetary limitations or whatever the reasoning might be. So I understand that there are limitations to the level of public engagement. And if our goal is to increase public engagement, we should look at what are those stages, and how might we tweak, adjust our engagement approach to involve the public and ensure greater equity. So I will say that what I left off of here is from the original model is this area of inform. So it's the first stage right before consult. And one of the things that I've learned over time is that if inform is our goal, then really that's just communication. And all public entities do that. And so does it really need to have a stage of public engagement? Because it's essentially just sharing information, which as a public entity, we are required to do. So you'll see here across what our goals are with public engagement in each level of this chart, of this diagram. Our goals may range from we want the public's input, we want to consider it, we want to ensure it's considered and it's among a series of choices. So we're involving the public in that state, or we're working with the public in collaboration to incorporate as much of their views and ideas as possible. But then in empower, which is the highest level of public engagement, we are implementing what the public decides. We will implement what we hear you say. And of course, as decision makers, we need to be judicious in the way that we decide whether we're going to be in empowerment or in collaboration. But it is something to consider along the way as a choice point, right? So we're about to make a decision, we're about to take an action. What choice point do we have to involve the public and at what level? So at collaborate, what we're saying is we're prioritizing shared decision-making in this regard, and to some extent, co-leadership in this structure, right? So that's where you see partnership between decision makers, you see citizen advisory committees, and you may see consensus building as part of collaboration. And empowering in itself is self-explanatory. It's to place the final decision-making in the hands of the public. Of course, there are steps that we would need to take to ensure that decisions that are made are aligned with our statutes and aligned with policies within the organization, but you can always explore where those choice points might make sense. So Rebecca, before I keep going, let me know if I have any questions.
Yeah, thank you. There's none in there, but I didn't mention in the beginning that you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll kind of break in and ask questions when there's a bit of a pause. So feel free to do that. Thank you.
So we're talking about public engagement. We're talking about inviting different perspectives and different opinions. And I don't know about you, but whenever I'm in a room with folks that have different perspectives and opinions, it oftentimes leads to some tension, maybe even conflict or dissent. And so I'm going to touch on that really, really quickly. I wanted to share the 6 principles for equitable and inclusive civic engagement. This is from the Kirwan Institute. I think it was developed, I want to say 2014, I may be incorrect. And so I'm not going to go through all of these. This will be in the slides that you'll share. But what I want to point out is that we've covered some of these already, right? So we've talked about this idea of exploring identities, because these are the gifts of diversity. We've talked about injustice, race, and power, to the extent that we've talked about the cycle of socialization and repeated patterns of behavior over time that build systems imbalance. We haven't talked about radical hospitality, and we'll talk a little bit more about listening, but I have touched on it in the earlier diagram on inclusive engagement, where we talked about what inclusive engagement looks like, and that it's meaningful, that it builds understanding and trust, that I'm learning more about the needs of the public, and that it invites meaningful input. This is where you would see more listening, and you would see inviting, this invitation to build in the relationship. These are critically important because again, we're humans and we're human doing and human being. And so this is where inclusive engagement would be a point to think about, but that also touches on the model that I shared on public engagement choice points, and that is where are we embedding invitations and listening as part of our equity, building equitable and inclusive engagement. So as a result of meeting these top three, what I'm offering is that we are at a better place to build trust and to demonstrate our commitment to change. And so that is kind of, doesn't really need to be said. I think all of us have had relationships where because we were seen as who we are and our needs were recognized in the moment, that reinforced trust. We have that same power, that same ability in our public service roles to reflect on the different needs that are before us and to find ways to meet those needs. Remember, we're talking about equity. So I want to talk about honoring dissent and embracing protest. Those are big words to essentially say, what do we do when things get tense? What do we do when there's conflict over an idea? I will offer, like I've already said, that there is strength in diversity and strength in different ideas and perspectives. And in strong agreements, we might see disagreement or dissent expressed often, but that can strengthen civic engagement. It can strengthen our dialogue and the environment in which we're doing this work, because it allows us to bring forward alternate choices, alternate options, and helps us to think deeply about the assumptions that we're making, right? The bias that we have. So we can look at dissent as a way of kind of exploring what is it that we're holding on individually and organizationally that we might let go? What are the biases that are present in the room? And how might I leverage or take advantage of the valuable community assets that are before me if I were to look at dissent or tension or conflict as a way of building community? And so there are times when we might be faced with conflict in a conversation or tension around a decision. And I would offer that that is an opportunity to pause, not step back, but to pause and to ask for more information, to ask questions around, how might this decision be impacting you? To be transparent enough to say, I don't understand the reaction, to this decision, and I'd like to understand more. Let's give more time to this discussion. One of my experiences in equitable systems is that we rush to completion, we rush to perfection, we rush to a decision, and we can make time serve us instead of we serving time. So in an engaging environment that supports a space for dialogue, however long it takes, and disagreement, can really help the public stay focused on new possibilities, even while holding on to different views on an issue. So making time for dissent is really important. And then this final note is on adaptability to community change. I would say that this conversation we're having now should not be, hopefully, is not the end of the conversation for you. And so part of adapting to change is that we're constantly looking at, in an iterative process, how we can amend, improve, enhance our approach to this public work. What information do we lack? Who have we not included, or who have we not talked to in order to change the systems that we are part of, right? I've talked about that already. We are born into these systems. We have no culpability, no responsibility in shaping these systems, but we do have a great, tremendous opportunity to change the systems that we are part of. So how are you, how is your team, how is the larger organization adapting to change as we see it in the community? We've been talking about public engagement. We've been talking about inclusive public engagement. I've talked to you about what does it look like to have inclusive engagement. And to repeat myself, I said that there are meaningful relationships that are built here, that understanding and trust is central to inclusive engagement. I've made an effort to learn more about the needs of the public, more about the priorities that they may have within their communities. I've allowed for meaningful input, and I'm looking at ways to, or I experience, excuse me, improvements in the quality of those decisions and in the consensus around those decisions. And so after we've talked about tension and conflict in the room and allowing for long or thoughtful dialogue over time, obviously, here are some strategies to think about when we talk about inclusive public engagement. And I've actually listed this in the priority that I think is important as public entities. I have 3 slides here. You may see this as totally different, but I offer this to you and to your committees as a way of doing a self-reflection. So the question to ask is, what do we have in place, whether it's a process, a policy, or it's just an informal practice? What do we have in place that helps us to meet or accomplish these strategies? So like diverse representation, right? How do we ensure that the public engagement process includes diverse identities and thoughts and perspectives? What are ways that we're capturing these perspectives? Do we have a practice to ensure our meetings are and the formats are inclusive, right? So it's not just virtual or in person, but we found ways to ensure that our meetings are accessible at any location and time, and that we've provided material and information in different languages and formats because we want to hear from all identities. What mechanisms do we have in place to ensure ongoing feedback? We need ongoing feedback as part of this adapting to community change. And with that, I would say, I would want us to ensure that those with the least access have an opportunity to provide input, right? Our systems are imbalanced in the sense that they favor those with the most access. They favor those or benefit those who have historically benefited, have a deeper understanding of these systems, know where to go, know who to ask. And so as a public entity, as public agency, organization, and public servants, could we develop mechanisms to ensure ongoing feedback throughout our processes? Transparent communication. You know, transparency gets overused. What I'm saying here is that we share information that is important to the decision that's about to be made, right? As a member of the public, I want to know the information that might change or shift or influence the decision that's being made. And so we share that repeatedly as often as we can, and again, with those who have the least access so that we can maintain that transparency. Again, as a checklist for you, as a tool to use internally or on your teams and committee, how do we address conflict? What is the process that we have in place to address conflict? I think that that's something that every team should identify, every committee should identify at their start and revisit every time a new committee member comes on. How are we going to address disagreements? And how are we going to foster respectful dialogue and consensus building? This is true internally for your committees and also across in public engagement. Capacity building is really important because if we think about systems that are inequitable and have been repeatedly so over time, what has essentially happened is that those marginalized groups, those with the least access, who have been left out of these discussions over time essentially don't know how to access um, these processes. They don't know how to get the information that they need. And they may know it, but maybe they don't know how to circumvent some of the barriers or the obstacles that are put in place. And so as a public serving committee, or as a public facing organization, I would offer that training and support is critical. Again, we're talking about equity, giving people what they need, particularly with where they are at, providing them training and support so that there is capacity building for the public to fully participate and experience, experience public engagement in a way that invites their input.
Hey, Lucretia, if I may jump in, we got a question.
Oh, okay.
This is a really good point to ask it, I think.
Okay.
And the question is, for some reason, many DEI attempts forget about the disabled community as the disabled communities intersect race, religion, identity, etc. How can we ensure that this intersectionality is included? And one point that this person made was that she wishes that the slides had been posted in advance so that for those that have blindness, they have a chance to review them in advance. I did mention that you are reading most of what's on the slides, but I just wondered if you could address that.
Whoever that is, you are absolutely right. And that these slides should have been posted in advance. You are absolutely correct. And I'm grateful for this space where I can hear this and I can correct this. And so I'll work on doing that for the next session. But one of the ways I think that we can be intentional about looking at intersectionality is I think that we have to make public statements and make multiple pathways for individuals to self-identify when they need to, if it's necessary, but also ensure all pathways are equally accessible for anyone, just regardless of what their ability, using quote fingers, might be. I think that my experience is that historically we design for visible, so we design by default for what people might say normal. That's not the right word, but that's the word I've often heard used. And we do that by default. But if we were to, as organizations, as leaders, committee members, however you might frame it, be intentional about very early on designing for all abilities, I think that is the best way, particularly because not everyone feels comfortable in self-identifying that they have a disability, right? And it also puts the burden on the individual to solve a systemic issue as opposed to solving the systemic issue. And so hopefully that's an answer to that question. And if not, I'm here. I'll answer any more questions.
We have one more, if I may just jump in with this one too, and then we can keep going. Someone said, for me, under-recognized groups may also include groups not only diverse, but extreme backgrounds and perspectives. How do we ensure that they are also heard, recognized? I personally push them away and don't want their input. I mean, any groups with extreme views who typically have bigoted views that I'm not interested in hearing. Being tolerant means being tolerant to different viewpoints, but I don't have the patience or tolerance for their extreme views. How do we handle this? This is a real struggle for me.
Yeah, I think all of us are trying to figure out a way that we can balance inviting feedback and input, inviting different perspectives, while at the same time ensuring that the spaces that we are in are safe and respectful, right? That dialogue continues to flow and is meaningful and doesn't allow room for divisive and oftentimes, I would say, abusive, bullying, close to violent language. And so what I would say again is sometimes we got to think about who holds the power. If we hold the power to shape how spaces will honor and respect the diversity in the room, we can establish a framework that says we will hear diverse perspectives and opinions, but this is the line that we won't allow you to cross, right? We can also ensure that our values are such that they promote, foster, and encourage diverse perspectives, but also make it clear that some behavior and some language is not accepted in this space. And then, quite honestly, because if we think about the cycle of socialization and how we early on heard messages that were reinforced over time, like it started with us. And so we have to be the ones to say, what I'm hearing you say is offensive or divisive. And unless you can reframe that in a different way, then I'm going to ask you to stop talking or sit down or hold that for another time or put that in writing or whatever that might be. But the other ways that we can do that is we may want to thoughtfully think about, can I hold engagements or discussions with underrepresented groups separately from maybe the dominant group? Because I know that if I don't do that, I may get some loud voices in the room who are disruptive and distracting. So there are different ways in which we can approach it, but I would first say that we, as organizations, should establish practice or policies that make it really clear that while we're here to have dialogue, we're not here to be abusive in our language, and we're not here to be divisive, and then align those with our goals. So we can, I'm available to talk more about that if anyone has any questions. Was there another question? No? Okay. So the last point I'll make on here, and there's one more slide, but I won't cover it, is this idea of cultural competency. And what that essentially means is that we're making sure that we, as leaders, we as facilitators, moderators, group chairs, committee chairs, whatever it might be, that we have a good foundation of cultural competency, and we're aware of the needs and values of different stakeholder groups. The last person that asked the question seemed to be pretty aware of those things, so that we know where to step in those engagements, and we know where to be mindful and thoughtful about how we frame the spaces, how we frame the question, how we frame the environment for equitable and inclusive engagement. So I said I was going to skip over this. I'm going to make sure this slide is available. These slides are available. So let's move to this section where we'll talk a little bit more about intent to impact. What I shared in the last class was this diagram from NKCDC. It's a government organization, and they kind of made this visual around equity lens to make better decisions. And why I'm sharing this with us is because oftentimes we think about equity work or an equity lens as something overly complicated. And what it really is, as I mentioned before, is a set of questions that really helps us to unpack why do we make the decisions that we do? What is behind it? Who's involved? Who's not involved? What are the perspectives that I might be missing? What am I measuring? What am I looking at? What am I communicating, right? So it's really a way to hold a mirror up to us, ourselves, or our committee to ask deeper questions that oftentimes our bias may prevent us from actually exploring, right? So this is a way of unraveling our bias and unpacking some of our norms and our habits to think about what are we intending here, but what is the impact of what we're intending? So I want to share this as a model, and then you'll probably look at this more in the next session. But in this model that I wanted to share, when I talk about equity and implementation, I'm talking about equity as a process, as part of the engagement process. and using the tools that we've shared thus far to slow down and examine where are the roots of past outcomes, where are the roots of past outcomes, and also to explore what outcomes we are hoping to achieve. So this 4 steps basically says, I reflect, we think about who we are, who am I, what's my identity, how might that impact the decision, the thoughts that I have in this moment, what's the history around the work that we're doing, the communities that we're serving, this particular area of interest. What assumptions and attitudes do I have? Do we have? Does the organization have? And how do we know these things, right? We're looking for evidence of that. Step 2 around planning is really around data collection. We need data so that it can be evidence-based. Let's look at data. Let's look at demographic. Let's look at where money is being spent. Let's look around on the committee and see, where's the diversity? How do I know? Have we talked a little bit about exploring identities as a committee? And then holding inclusive discussions. We've already talked about that, but that's also a place to collect data, right? So we're doing this on our committees. We're talking about identities. We're talking about lived experiences. We're getting different perspectives. We're sitting through and working through the tension of disagreement to get information that we need as part of planning. This is where the public engagement process may also kick off, where you may start a public engagement process by asking for different perspectives from our community and from underrepresented groups. This is a place too where I would be mindful of who's in the room again. So is this a place where you may want to stop and say, we need to hear from underrepresented groups where we also want to create safety. And so we're separating folks at the beginning so that we can hear without all the noise. The 3rd and 4th step, act, and that is to embed equity as part of the process. We've talked about public engagement and what that looks like. We've also talked about an equity lens. All right, we're about to act. Who's impacted by this? Who have we not included? And continue to collect that information along the way. And then finally, we're doing an evaluation or we're measuring. And we measure because it raises to our awareness what success looks like, what the outcomes are. It also helps us to keep track of and report on our progress so that we can see change over time. And then we might need to iterate. So I've got data that says the outcomes are not what we expected. We really wanted to see more people participate in these meetings, more people of color, more folks who identify with a disability. It hasn't really happened. So let's go back to step 2 and collect information again. Let's ask the people who are most affected to find out what is it that we need to provide to ensure that you can fully access this public engagement or fully be a part of the implementation of this decision. I talked fast on that. I was trying to get us to 6:30. I don't know if anyone else has a question. These slides will be available. I do want to say that what I'm sharing with you today, quite honestly, are not intended to be complicated ideas. They're intended to be ideas to just help us to think a little bit more about the impact of our decisions. And while I know as public servants, we have good intent, we're interested in the well-being of our community and our constituency. It does serve us and serve them, serve our public, to take a deeper look and to evaluate it through the lens of equity. So do we have any questions? So sorry to been through that so quickly, but if anyone has questions that they want to send to Rebecca, I will gladly follow up with those questions if they're sent by email.
That sounds good. Well, thank you. Does anyone want to sneak a question in? Otherwise we will, this will be uploaded to the website. I think this was a great session. for watch parties at advisory groups, and things to think about as our advisory groups are going to start working on their 2024 work plans, and as we look at new members coming on board at the beginning of the year. So I will, if I don't see any other questions, somebody was asking about the link for part 2 of tonight. You would have gotten that when you registered. So if you want to hop back onto the kcowa.us/advisory group DEI, you can still register for the next class. That's still open. So go ahead and jump in there and do that, and you should get a link to join. I hope that answers your question. So thank you all for being here again, and we'll send out some follow-up information. Be sure to take the survey, and we'll see you at 7 o'clock.